The moment Lieutenant Hiroshi Takeda opened the rusted metal chest in the dimly lit corner of the abandoned Tokyo warehouse, a single brittle sheet of paper fluttered to the floor like a fallen ghost, and with it, the secrets of a war that had been deliberately buried for over half a century. The air smelled of dust, rust, and a faint metallic tang that prickled the senses. Hiroshi's heart hammered, not from fear, but from the sense that he had stumbled upon something the world was never meant to know. In that instant, the past whispered, urging him to remember what had been forgotten. The chest had been concealed behind stacked crates, their labeling long faded beyond recognition, a remnant of the chaos that followed Japan's surrender in 1945. Hiroshi, a historian working for a private archival project, had been tipped to this location by an elderly retired officer whose trembling hands betrayed the weight of his knowledge. He had warned, "There are files here, things that could change everything you think you know." Hiroshi had laughed off the exaggeration at first, imagining nothing more than mundane reports, old propaganda leaflets, perhaps photographs of soldiers long gone. But now, as he ran his fingers over the brittle folders, he realized the old man's warning was understatement at its most chilling. The first folder bore a simple, unassuming label in faded ink, Operation Yamato, Confidential. Opening it revealed diagrams, orders, and handwritten notes in a meticulous script that hinted at a mind obsessed with secrecy. Hiroshi's eyes widened as he scanned the contents: maps of Pacific islands that had never been acknowledged in public records, lists of personnel who did not exist in any official registry, and accounts of missions that had ended in catastrophe, or had never been reported at all. Among the pages, there was a photograph of a man standing alone on a dock, his eyes hardened, unyielding, as if staring through the veil of history itself. A soldier who had been deliberately erased from memory. The sheer scale of the concealment was staggering. These were not merely forgotten field reports, they were a deliberate erasure. Hiroshi's mind raced, piecing together fragmented clues from what the files revealed: covert operations in the South Pacific that had been disguised as minor skirmishes, plans for weapons whose existence had never been acknowledged, and most chilling of all, references to a network of spies embedded deep within Allied-occupied territories. Every page he turned seemed to pulse with a hidden energy, a story demanding to be told. And yet, the documents carried a sinister undertone. Those who had handled them before had taken extraordinary measures to vanish without a trace. The next folder introduced Hiroshi to the human element behind these missions. Handwritten letters, partially charred and brittle with age, told the story of soldiers who had been ordered to impossible tasks, men and women whose loyalty had been tested to the breaking point. One letter, smudged with tears and ink, recounted the final hours of a young officer stationed on a remote island, describing the despair, the hunger, and the choices forced upon him by orders that no one else would ever know existed. Hiroshi felt a shiver crawl down his spine. This was not dry historical data, these were lives lived in the shadow of secrecy, sacrificed not only to the war effort but to history itself. As he delved deeper, the files began to reveal a timeline that contradicted official records. Engagements that had been dismissed as minor setbacks were described in grim detail, ambushes that had decimated entire units, covert raids that had shifted the balance of power in strategic locations, and decisions made at the highest levels that had been erased from government archives. Hiroshi realized that the implications were enormous. This wasn't just hidden history, it was a parallel account of the war, one in which the shadows told a far more complex and morally ambiguous story than textbooks had ever admitted. Hours passed unnoticed. The warehouse was silent except for the soft rustle of paper and Hiroshi's own shallow breaths. Each revelation brought a mix of exhilaration and dread. Who had ordered these files hidden? What had driven men to commit acts they could never speak of? And most importantly, what truths could now come to light if he chose to tell the story? Hiroshi felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He was no longer just a historian. He was a witness to a truth that others had fought desperately to suppress. Suddenly, a folded envelope slipped from between the pages of a folder labeled simply, "Top Secret, Emperor's Orders." Inside was a series of coded instructions and a single photograph of a massive naval vessel, annotated with cryptic numbers and arrows. Hiroshi's pulse quickened. The notes suggested not only technological experiments but also a plan for a decisive strike that had never been reported. Could this have altered the outcome of the Pacific Theater? He paused, absorbing the magnitude of the discovery. Each piece of paper seemed to scream, "History is not what you have been told." Look closer. The sun had long since set outside, casting faint streaks of orange light through the grime-streaked windows. Shadows of crates stretched across the concrete floor like silent sentinels. Hiroshi knew he could not possibly absorb all of this in one sitting, yet he could not leave. There was a magnetic pull, a sense that the story was alive and waiting to be told. In that moment, he understood the peril of his mission. Others had tried to uncover these secrets, and vanished. And yet, he could not resist. The chest was more than an artifact, it was a door to truths that demanded recognition. Hiroshi's fingers lingered over the final folder of the night, labeled Project Kamikaze, Final Documentation. His breath caught. These documents recounted the planning of suicide missions that had been sanitized in history books, showing the intricate network of communication, the psychological conditioning of young pilots, and the clandestine decisions made to mask failures as honorable sacrifices. He felt a knot in his stomach, a mixture of horror and fascination. How could humanity reconcile with the truths hidden in these files? And who decided that they should remain buried, their stories untold? As the first light of dawn filtered through the warehouse windows, Hiroshi knew that he had crossed the threshold. The hidden world of Japan's wartime secrecy, long buried by time and official decree, lay before him. He had glimpsed the edges of a narrative that challenged everything he thought he knew. The chest, the files, the letters, the photographs, they were no longer just artifacts. They were voices, echoes of the past demanding to be heard. And Hiroshi Takeda, trembling but resolute, understood that he would be the one to tell them. The war had ended decades ago, yet its secrets were alive, pulsating beneath layers of paper and dust. And in that quiet warehouse, amidst the shadows and the silence, history itself waited, suspended. Poised to reveal the hidden truths that no one wanted the world to see, the morning sun barely pierced the grime of the warehouse windows, but Hiroshi Takeda barely noticed. His focus was entirely consumed by the contents of the chest, the folders now spread across a long, dust-covered table. Each sheet was a fragment of a larger puzzle, a clandestine world that had been deliberately excised from official records. As he sorted the files, a pattern began to emerge, dates, locations, and names forming a map of secret operations that had never been acknowledged outside the walls of Imperial headquarters. The war Hiroshi thought he knew was only half told. These were the chapters no one wanted written. He picked up a folder labeled Operation Tsukuyomi and gingerly opened it. The folder contained meticulous reports from naval intelligence officers, outlining the covert deployment of reconnaissance submarines along the Pacific Rim. The reports were precise, almost obsessively so, detailing timings, fuel calculations, and the intended collection of Allied troop movements. What was astonishing was the scale of secrecy. These operations were carried out without official acknowledgement, without leaving any paper trail in public archives. For decades, these missions had existed only in the shadows of the officers' memories, or in folders like these, waiting to be discovered. Hiroshi's eyes widened at a particular set of annotations, a series of handwritten instructions in a mix of kanji and cryptic shorthand, clearly written under duress or in extreme secrecy. One line read, "If captured, destroy all documents and claim non-existence. Mission success depends on silence." The weight of the words settled on him. These were not ordinary wartime reports, they were confessions in code, tiny screams from the past. Every operator, every pilot, every sailor who had followed these orders had been erased from official history, their existence scrubbed in the name of national security. Hiroshi realized that he was holding more than just paper. He was holding evidence of lives deliberately vanished from memory. The files also contained first-hand accounts of these missions. One letter, written by a young sailor to his family, described a reconnaissance mission over an uncharted island chain, where the crew had witnessed Allied preparations for a massive assault. The sailor's words were fraught with tension, fear, and a grim sense of duty. "We are shadows," he wrote. "No one will remember us. No one must. Hiroshi traced the faded lines with his finger, imagining the boy, barely 20, scanning the horizon from the deck of a submarine, knowing that if he returned alive, the world would pretend he had never existed. Hiroshi shivered. The human cost behind secrecy was staggering. The next folder, Project Kaijin, revealed the experimental development of unconventional weapons. Sketches of small amphibious vehicles, designed to penetrate enemy harbors undetected, filled the pages. Notes indicated tests conducted on remote islands, far from Allied observation, some resulting in catastrophic failures that were never reported. One report described a failed prototype that sank with its operators aboard. The official record simply listed it as equipment lost in training exercises. Hiroshi could not suppress a pang of sorrow. These missions were simultaneously innovative and horrifying, an intersection of human ingenuity and tragic sacrifice, deliberately hidden to maintain the illusion of orderly historical record. As he moved deeper into the files, Hiroshi uncovered references to a network of spies operating in Southeast Asia and China. Their identities were masked by pseudonyms and coded references. One report recounted the infiltration of key supply depots, the theft of critical intelligence, and even the assassination of officers deemed obstacles to strategic objectives. The operations were bold and often brutal, yet the files painted the participants not as villains, but as desperate human beings maneuvering within the suffocating strictures of wartime command. Hiroshi felt the tension mounting within him. The stories were gripping, almost cinematic, and he realized that reconstructing these narratives would expose a morally complex truth long suppressed. Hours passed unnoticed. The outside world seemed distant, irrelevant. Hiroshi was consumed by the people in these files, the commanders who had made impossible choices, the soldiers and spies who had executed them, and the civilians whose lives had been swept into the shadows of secrecy. One folder contained the personal diary of a female operative, codenamed Sakura, detailing missions behind enemy lines. Her words were hauntingly intimate, blending fear, resolve, and moments of tenderness rarely acknowledged in the brutality of war. She wrote of leaving messages for loved ones she would never see again, and of the unbearable pressure to succeed while knowing that discovery would mean death, not just for herself, but for anyone associated with her work. Hiroshi's chest tightened. Every word he read drew him further into a labyrinth of hidden histories. It was then that he stumbled upon an odd discrepancy. Two sets of reports described the same operation in strikingly different terms. One detailed a swift, efficient strike on an Allied supply route, the other implied the mission had failed disastrously, with heavy casualties. The notes were contradictory yet equally precise, suggesting a deliberate alteration in official reporting. Hiroshi realized he was witnessing the mechanics of historical erasure firsthand. The Japanese high command had manipulated narratives, suppressing failures while highlighting selective successes, constructing a version of the war that bore little resemblance to reality. What he held in his hands was the unvarnished truth. By mid-afternoon, Hiroshi's resolve began to solidify. He would not simply catalog these files. He would tell the story, connecting these hidden missions to the broader narrative of the Pacific War, illuminating the lives and decisions that had been deliberately obscured. But he also recognized the danger. If the wrong eyes discovered these files, the consequences could be severe. He had already crossed into forbidden territory, and every subsequent page carried risks as well as revelations. Among the final folders he examined that day was Operation Hiryu, a plan for an audacious intelligence coup involving the interception of Allied communications from multiple bases. The document outlined meticulous scheduling, decoy operations, and contingency plans for failure. It also contained a chilling note: if this operation fails, all knowledge must vanish with those involved. Hiroshi paused, imagining the officers and enlisted personnel who had carried out these missions. The stakes had been literal life and death, and the world had remained ignorant of their courage, sacrifice, and fear. As dusk approached, Hiroshi carefully replaced the folders in the chest, his mind buzzing with questions and the weight of responsibility. He felt as though he had crossed a threshold, moving from mere historian to custodian of a suppressed narrative. Every mission, every spy, every secret weapon in these files was a thread in a tapestry the world had never been allowed to see. And as he locked the chest and prepared to leave the warehouse, he understood that the journey ahead, reconstructing these hidden histories, would be both exhilarating and perilous. Hiroshi stepped out into the cooling evening air, the distant hum of Tokyo life a stark contrast to the hidden wars that had unfolded in secret. His thoughts were already racing, anticipating the unraveling of Operation Tsukuyomi, Project Kaijin, and the courage of operatives like Sakura. Each folder held a story, each story demanded to be told. And somewhere deep within him, a voice whispered that what he was about to uncover would challenge everything the world thought it knew about Japan's role in World War II. The next morning, Hiroshi returned to the warehouse with a single purpose: to immerse himself fully in the human stories concealed within the files. For all the diagrams, mission orders, and secret weapon schematics, it was the lives of the men and women, their fears, their courage, their choices, that called to him most urgently. He spread the folders across the long, scarred table once again, each one a window into a hidden world that had been deliberately excised from memory. Today, Hiroshi would begin to reconstruct not just the events of these covert operations, but the human hearts that had borne their weight. He began with Sakura, the female operative whose diary he had glimpsed the previous day. The diary's pages were yellowed and frayed, written in a careful, almost elegant hand. Her entries chronicled missions that defied imagination, smuggling critical intelligence across enemy lines, disguising herself as a local villager, evading capture by sheer instinct. Each entry conveyed a mixture of fear and resolve. "Every step I take," she had written on one page, "could be my last. Yet I must move, for the men who await my message, for the country I serve, though no one will ever know." Hiroshi traced the inked lines with trembling fingers. It was as if Sakura was speaking directly across decades, her voice carrying the weight of unsung sacrifices. Other folders revealed men whose names had vanished from history. One folder recounted the story of Lieutenant Kenji Saito, a reconnaissance officer sent to map enemy fortifications along a remote Pacific atoll. His reports described tropical storms that had wrecked ships, disease that had ravaged crews, and the relentless tension of knowing any mistake could mean death, not just for him, but for the entire unit. The files contained sketches Saito had made of the islands and coastlines, annotated with notes about hidden enemy positions. Hiroshi could almost feel the lieutenant's anxiety, the mixture of determination and terror that defined his every decision. Sato's life had ended in secrecy, his disappearance never acknowledged. Now, decades later, Hiroshi was piecing it back together. The stories were not all about valor, some spoke of moral compromise and unbearable choices. A folder labeled Operation Kurigane contained testimony from soldiers ordered to sabotage civilian facilities suspected of aiding the Allies. The files revealed the inner conflict of those who carried out these actions dictated by orders, but weighted with personal guilt. Hiroshi could feel the tension between duty and conscience pressing from the pages. History often presents war in black and white, but here he found shades of gray, raw and unflinching, that no official archive had ever dared to show. Among the documents were letters exchanged between operatives and their families, smuggled across battle lines or delivered by intermediaries who risked capture. One letter, from a young soldier named Hiroto Fujimura, addressed simply to his mother, detailed the quiet moments before a critical mission. He wrote of longing for home, for the scent of cherry blossoms and the warmth of familiar laughter, even as he prepared to carry out a task that could end in death. Hiroshi's throat tightened. The war, for those in these files, was never abstract strategy, it was deeply personal, a crucible that burned away innocence and demanded courage few could understand. Hiroshi noticed a recurring theme in the correspondence: isolation. Many operatives were cut off from communication, surviving in remote locations for months at a time, executing missions without guidance, and relying on sheer ingenuity to survive. Some had left records in meticulous detail, others in fragmentary notes that hinted at desperation, resourcefulness, or despair. One particularly haunting entry described a man who, stranded on a remote island after his ship was destroyed, maintained daily logs of enemy ship movements using rudimentary instruments and crude sketches. Knowing that his survival alone was not enough, his records were the only evidence that the mission had ever existed. As Hiroshi delved deeper, he began to map the human network behind the files. Names, codenames, and locations interwove into a complex web of clandestine efforts. He discovered that Sakura had collaborated with Lieutenant Saito on a mission that had required both of them to evade Allied patrols for days while delivering intelligence critical to Japan's strategic operations. Cross-referencing the accounts, Hiroshi reconstructed the harrowing sequence: a stolen canoe across a jagged reef, a night spent hiding in thick mangroves, enemy patrols passing within meters of their location. The coordination, courage, and sheer luck required were staggering. And yet, in the official history books, their story did not exist. The files also revealed betrayals and dangers from within. Some operatives had been betrayed by colleagues or superiors, resulting in imprisonment or death, and the incidents were swiftly excised from records. Hiroshi shuddered at a report detailing a double-cross during Operation Tsukuyomi, where a trusted officer had delivered critical intelligence to the wrong command, causing confusion and loss of life. The official narrative had painted the failure as a tactical mishap, but the files told a story of human error, fear, and manipulation. It was raw, uncomfortable, and undeniably real. By mid-afternoon, Hiroshi's obsession had deepened. He traced the paths of operatives like Sakura and Saito across the Pacific, piecing together timelines and locations that had been deliberately obscured. He imagined their footsteps along coral beaches, their nights spent under stars, and the whispered conversations that determined life or death. Every folder he examined added layers to their humanity, revealing that the war was not just a series of battles but a tapestry of decisions, courage, fear, and moral compromise. The files had transformed faceless numbers into vivid individuals, men and women whose lives were once invisible to history. Then, tucked into a folder labeled Communications Blackout, Classified, Hiroshi found an unusual note, written in a hurried scrawl: "By the way, if you're clinging to this moment with me, make sure to hit subscribe, more waits just ahead." He blinked, startled, then smiled. Even decades later, some messages could transcend time, connecting curiosity, urgency, and commitment. The line reminded him that uncovering history was not just about observing, it was about sharing, about ensuring these voices were heard beyond the dusty walls of a forgotten warehouse. The day waned, and Hiroshi carefully replaced the folders, each one now a vivid repository of human courage and hidden history. He stepped outside, the setting sun bathing Tokyo in an amber glow, his mind teeming with the faces and voices he had encountered. He understood now that the hidden missions were more than strategic maneuvers, they were the lived experiences of people whose sacrifices had been erased, who had borne secrets heavier than mountains. Hiroshi felt the responsibility of a guardian, to illuminate the darkness, to tell the stories that had been suppressed, and to restore humanity to the historical record. As night fell, he lingered on a particular image, a photograph of Sakura, crouched in shadow, eyes wide with determination, ink-stained hands clutching maps and coded messages. The photograph, once hidden in a folder, now seemed to gaze at him, a silent plea for recognition. Hiroshi felt a surge of resolve. The hidden missions, the erased operatives, the suppressed failures, they all demanded to be remembered. And he would be their voice, guiding the world into the truths that had been deliberately hidden for generations. The warehouse had taken on an almost sacred stillness by the time Hiroshi Takeda returned the next morning. Sunlight slanted through the dusty windows, falling in stripes across the stacks of crates and the chest that had become his portal to a forgotten past. He approached it with a mixture of reverence and dread, knowing that what he would uncover today could redefine the narrative of Japan's role in World War II entirely. The files he had already studied had introduced him to hidden operations and operatives, but the folders he now reached for suggested a level of danger and secrecy beyond anything he had yet imagined. The first folder bore the ominous label, Operation Tsunami, Strategic Override. Opening it revealed diagrams and hand-drawn maps of previously unknown Allied supply lines, alongside elaborate instructions for sabotage missions designed to cripple enemy movements without leaving evidence. But the most striking revelation was a set of annotations in red ink, warning of extreme consequences if missions failed. Capture is death. Silence is survival, read one line. Hiroshi's pulse quickened. These were not minor skirmishes, they were deliberate, high-risk maneuvers where the cost of failure was total erasure, of personnel and of events, from history itself. As he read on, he discovered the intricate planning behind clandestine assassination missions targeting high-ranking Allied officers. The files detailed coordination between naval intelligence, covert operatives, and the newly developed communication systems meant to avoid detection. Some plans were successful, others had failed catastrophically, with the operatives either killed or forced into hiding. The sheer audacity of these operations stunned Hiroshi. The careful concealment of successes and failures alike had ensured that the world would never know the true scale of these secret undertakings. And yet, the documents made it clear that these missions had profoundly influenced the trajectory of the war. Hiroshi paused to examine a sequence of photographs tucked into a folder labeled Project Covert. They depicted a massive, partially constructed battleship in a hidden dockyard, its presence intentionally excluded from public records. Notes indicated that the vessel was intended for a decisive strike that never materialized, thwarted not by enemy forces but by internal miscommunication and logistical failures deliberately covered up in official reports. Hiroshi traced the lines of the photographs with his finger, feeling the weight of what had been concealed. The files suggested a world of calculated risk and human ambition operating beyond public knowledge, a war hidden within the war. By the mid-afternoon, Hiroshi had unearthed the most shocking discovery yet, a folder titled Project Shinigami, Covert Aerial Missions. Inside were detailed plans for aircraft designed not only for reconnaissance but for stealth strikes on key Allied positions, along with reports on the pilots who carried out these missions. Their bravery and skill were extraordinary, yet the documentation emphasized the inevitability of death. Many pilots were young, barely trained, yet entrusted with missions that would determine the success of critical operations. The files described their final moments with clinical detachment, detailing precise flight paths, enemy responses, and the ultimate erasure of their existence from official records. Hiroshi felt a cold shiver run down his spine. These were not just secret missions, they were silent sacrifices, erased by design. Amid the shock, Hiroshi noticed a small envelope at the bottom of the folder. Inside was a single note in a hurried scrawl. By the way, if you're clinging to this moment with me, make sure to hit subscribe, more awaits just ahead. Hiroshi chuckled despite the gravity of the documents. The note, clearly left by the archivist who had first handled these files decades ago, seemed almost prophetic. Even in secrecy, someone had understood the importance of sharing these truths, ensuring that the hidden stories of courage, failure, and human endurance could eventually reach the world. He tucked the envelope aside and returned to the more pressing matter of untangling the complex operations described before him. Hiroshi's attention shifted to Operation Kurigane II, an initiative that combined espionage, sabotage, and experimental technology. Detailed schematics illustrated small, camouflaged submarines capable of evading detection while transporting operatives into enemy harbors. Reports described tense underwater maneuvers, technical failures, and the bravery of crews who risked their lives beneath the waves. Hiroshi realized that the technological ingenuity of these missions was matched only by the human courage required to execute them. Every misstep, every moment of hesitation, could have led to death, and yet the operatives persevered in silence, their achievements hidden in the shadows of history. Among the most disturbing revelations was a series of reports on coerced collaborations. Some civilians, engineers, and technicians had been forced to contribute to secret projects under threat of imprisonment or execution. Their names had been removed from documentation to protect the secrecy of operations, yet their contributions were critical. Hiroshi traced the faint lines of guilt, fear, and silent defiance embedded within the text. He realized that these files were not merely military records, they were human testimonies, fraught with moral ambiguity, the kind of truths that history textbooks rarely accommodate. The day waned, and Hiroshi's exhaustion grew. Yet he pressed on, compelled by a sense of duty. Each folder added another layer of complexity, failed missions disguised as routine reports, extraordinary heroism hidden behind the veil of secrecy, and a tapestry of human emotion woven into the calculated logic of war. He could see the faces of the operatives in his mind: Sakura crouched in the jungle, a pilot navigating the treacherous Pacific skies, a young engineer in a hidden workshop, all silently demanding recognition. The files were no longer just documents, they were voices echoing across decades, seeking to reclaim a place in history. As night fell, Hiroshi carefully returned the folders to the chest, locking it with a sense of solemn responsibility. He stepped out into the cool evening, the city lights of Tokyo stretching in the distance. The discoveries of the day had revealed the extraordinary lengths to which the Japanese military had gone to conceal operations, the courage and sacrifice of individuals erased from memory, and the dangerous intersection of secrecy and survival. He knew that his work was only beginning, that the stories he had uncovered deserved to be told in full. And as he walked into the night, the sense of urgency pressed upon him. The world needed to see these hidden files, to understand the untold truth of a war fought in shadows. Hiroshi Takeda awoke the next morning with a restless urgency. The files he had uncovered were no longer mere documents, they were living testimonies, each one a pulse in the hidden veins of history. He knew that to tell these stories was to confront not only the past but the present, for the shadows of decisions made decades ago still lingered, quietly shaping narratives and influencing memory. Today, he would follow the threads of the hidden missions into their consequences, tracing the human, strategic, and moral ripples that had quietly radiated across the Pacific. The first folder he examined bore the label Aftermath, Operation Tsunami. Hiroshi carefully unfolded the brittle pages, revealing reports of missions whose success or failure had profoundly altered the lives of soldiers, civilians, and entire communities. One account described a sabotage mission in which a small unit had destroyed a supply depot, unknowingly triggering shortages that led to famine in nearby villages. The files carefully excused the military's responsibility, yet the human cost was painfully evident in reports of suffering, malnutrition, and disease. Hiroshi felt a knot in his stomach. History often simplifies war into numbers of troops and territory gained, but these files illuminated the hidden collateral damage, the consequences deliberately hidden to preserve a sanitized narrative. Further along, he discovered letters from operatives who survived catastrophic missions. Lieutenant Kenji Saito, whose reconnaissance missions had once seemed heroic, had lived with lifelong trauma. A letter written years later, smuggled through sympathetic officers, described nightmares, guilt over fallen comrades, and the constant fear that the world had forgotten their sacrifices. Hiroshi read each line with empathy, imagining the weight of decades spent silently carrying secrets too dangerous to share. The files suggested a nationwide pattern. Many survivors lived under self-imposed silence, burdened by the knowledge that their stories, if revealed, could disrupt national pride or challenge prevailing historical accounts. Among the most striking documents were testimonies about civilian engineers and laborers coerced into secret projects. A report in Project Kaijin Aftermath detailed the ethical dilemmas faced by men and women forced to develop experimental submarines and aircraft. They were complicit in projects whose ultimate aims were devastating, yet refusal carried threats of imprisonment or execution. Hiroshi realized that the consequences of these operations were not confined to the battlefield, they extended into the moral fabric of society, creating silent trauma that endured long after the surrender. The files humanized history in a way textbooks rarely attempt, revealing that the true cost of secrecy often lay not just in lives lost, but in the hearts and minds of those compelled to serve in silence. One folder, Operation Shinigami Aftermath, revealed the fates of pilots who had flown covert missions over enemy lines. While the official history celebrated a small number of recognized missions, these files detailed dozens more, many of which ended in disaster. Some pilots were killed, others captured and executed without records of their fate, and a few survived to live in obscurity. Hiroshi was struck by the recurring motif of erasure, the deliberate omission of events and individuals from the historical record. He understood now that the consequences of secrecy extended beyond immediate deaths. It reshaped collective memory, creating gaps where real people and real events had existed. The human dimension of these consequences was underscored by accounts of families who never received word of their loved ones. Letters in the files described parents and spouses left in agonizing uncertainty, believing their sons, daughters, or spouses had simply vanished. Some families spent decades searching for answers, only to be met with bureaucratic silence. Hiroshi felt the gravity of their suffering. He realized that the hidden missions had created not just forgotten heroes, but forgotten victims, people whose grief had been compounded by deliberate historical suppression. The files demanded recognition not only for acts of courage but also for lives quietly upended by secrecy. Yet the consequences were not only personal, they were geopolitical. Hiroshi traced references to decisions made during these covert operations that inadvertently influenced battles and diplomatic outcomes. For example, the failure of a single reconnaissance mission had delayed critical intelligence, altering the timing of a major Allied assault. The files suggested that small, unseen actions, missions erased from history, had ripple effects that shaped the course of the war. Hiroshi marveled at the complexity. What appeared in textbooks as a straightforward chain of victories and defeats was in reality a web of secret maneuvers, human courage, and unforeseeable consequences. The moral ambiguity of these revelations weighed heavily on Hiroshi. One particularly harrowing report described a sabotage operation targeting a port facility heavily used by civilians. While the mission succeeded in its strategic objective, the files quietly recorded civilian casualties and the emotional toll on the operatives who executed it. The officer in charge wrote, "I obeyed orders, but at what cost? The enemy suffered, yes, but so did innocents. Will anyone ever know the truth?" Hiroshi felt the full impact of the files' revelations. Hidden missions were not purely acts of strategy, they were intertwined with ethical dilemmas and human suffering that had been systematically suppressed. Hours passed, and Hiroshi leaned back in his chair, absorbing the weight of his discoveries. The consequences of Japan's hidden wartime operations extended far beyond the battlefield. They touched every aspect of human experience: fear, courage, trauma, grief, moral conflict, and memory itself. The files painted a portrait of a war fought not only with weapons and strategy but with secrecy and erasure. Hiroshi realized that the true mission he had undertaken was not merely to catalog these hidden operations but to illuminate their enduring impact, to give voice to those who had lived, suffered, and died in silence. As dusk settled over Tokyo, Hiroshi carefully organized the folders, ensuring that every detail remained intact. He felt the enormity of the responsibility pressing down on him. Each document was a thread in a complex tapestry, a reminder that history is never fully complete, that what is hidden often carries as much weight as what is recorded. And in that quiet moment, he resolved that the hidden consequences, the human cost, the moral ambiguity, the ripple effects of secrecy, would be central to the story he would tell. He had crossed into forbidden territory, but the revelations demanded attention. The files were no longer just history, they were a moral reckoning. By the following morning, Hiroshi Takeda's sense of urgency had transformed into a simmering determination. The files he had uncovered revealed not only covert operations and hidden missions but a deliberate, decades-long effort to erase their existence from memory. Each folder he examined was a testament to the lengths the Japanese military had gone to control history, and Hiroshi knew that revealing the truth carried risks, both to himself and to the fragile narrative of wartime memory. Yet the weight of secrecy was unbearable, the stories demanded to be told. Hiroshi approached the chest with caution, aware that someone, or some institution, might not want these documents resurfacing. Rumors of hidden archives and suppressed wartime operations were often dismissed as conspiracy, but he had learned that these files were real, meticulously detailed, and irrefutably human. Today, he would uncover the mission that seemed most carefully buried, Project Ryujin, a plan so audacious and morally ambiguous that even decades later it had been completely expunged from official histories. The folder was enormous, thicker than any Hiroshi had yet handled. Its first pages outlined a coordinated attack involving submarines, reconnaissance aircraft, and covert operatives tasked with infiltrating Allied-occupied islands to secure intelligence and disrupt communications. The operation's scope was unprecedented, involving dozens of personnel whose existence had never been officially acknowledged. Handwritten annotations hinted at the psychological toll on operatives. One note simply read, "Many will not return. Those who survive will carry secrets heavier than death." Hiroshi felt a chill. This was not just a military maneuver, it was a human crucible. Delving deeper, he uncovered the personal accounts of operatives assigned to Project Ryujin. One, a young pilot named Masato Ishikawa, described the relentless training required to fly stealth missions over enemy territory. Every mission feels like a dance with fate, Ishikawa wrote. We know the risk, yet we proceed, knowing the world will forget us. Hiroshi could almost feel the tension, the adrenaline, and the quiet despair encoded in Ishikawa's words. The files humanized what had otherwise been reduced to strategic reports and diagrams, revealing the courage, fear, and moral weight borne by those who lived in secrecy. The folder also contained detailed schematics of experimental technology used during the missions, mini-submarines designed for stealth infiltration, radio equipment for undetectable communication, and prototypes of aircraft capable of evading radar detection. Technical notes described both successes and failures, often with devastating consequences. One mission failed spectacularly, resulting in the loss of several operatives, yet the official records simply listed the aircraft as lost during transit. Hiroshi's heart ached at the realization that every technological triumph was shadowed by human cost, and that the world had remained oblivious for decades. Hours passed as Hiroshi pieced together the timeline of Project Ryujin. He discovered that the mission had influenced key battles, yet had been carefully excised from public records to maintain a sanitized narrative of Japan's wartime strategy. The more he read, the clearer it became that history itself had been manipulated, successes and failures, life and death, all selectively curated to protect national pride. Hiroshi felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. These stories demanded to be told in full, yet the act of revealing them might invite scrutiny, or worse. As he reached the final pages, Hiroshi encountered a folder labeled Contingency Measures, Project Ryujin. It contained chilling instructions for the disposal of all documents should the mission fail or be discovered by enemy forces. Destroy all records. Let no one know, one note read, followed by diagrams for concealing equipment, erasing operational tracks, and even neutralizing personnel if necessary. Hiroshi's pulse quickened. The lengths to which secrecy had been enforced were staggering, and he realized that uncovering these truths now put him in the crosshairs of the very shadows that had buried them. History, it seemed, still had its guardians. Amid the grim revelations, Hiroshi found personal letters tucked between pages, correspondence from operatives to loved ones, never sent, smuggled into the archives for posterity. One letter, from a soldier named Kenjiro Nakamura, was particularly poignant. If you find this, he wrote, know that I loved life, and I feared its end, yet I followed orders. The world will not remember us, but I hope it remembers our intent. Hiroshi felt the weight of decades of erasure pressing on his conscience. These words were a reminder that history is not only written by victories and defeats, but by human memory and silence. As evening approached, Hiroshi began to sense the growing tension outside the warehouse. Shadows seemed to linger longer, footsteps echoed unnaturally, and he was aware that someone may be watching, aware that the files had been disturbed. The decades of secrecy had not ended, the guardians of hidden history remained vigilant. Hiroshi's heart pounded as he carefully documented his findings, photographing key pages, copying notes, and creating a digital record. Every precaution he took felt necessary, yet insufficient. The files were powerful, their revelations dangerous, and he knew he was now part of a story that others would prefer remain untold. He paused, reflecting on the operatives, engineers, and civilians whose lives had been defined by Project Ryujin and similar operations. Their courage, their fear, and their moral dilemmas had been silenced for decades, buried in forgotten files. Hiroshi understood that the act of exposing these truths was not simply historical research, it was a moral duty. To honor those who had lived and died in secrecy, he would reconstruct their stories with care, accuracy, and respect. The world had been denied the full truth for too long. As night fell over Tokyo, Hiroshi carefully secured the chest, ensuring that every folder remained intact. He stepped outside, the cool air brushing against his face, and looked up at the city lights stretching across the horizon. Somewhere, beyond the decades and layers of secrecy, the ghosts of Project Ryujin and countless other missions seemed to watch him, waiting for recognition. Hiroshi felt a mixture of fear and resolve. The shadows of the past were dangerous, but the truth was more important than safety. The final part of his journey was near, and the most profound revelations were yet to come. The warehouse was silent, yet the air felt charged, as if the decades of suppressed history had gathered there, waiting for someone to bear witness. Hiroshi Takeda moved deliberately, aware that he was standing on the edge of a revelation that could alter perceptions of Japan's role in World War II forever. The final folder in the chest lay before him, Operation Kagemusha, The Final Secrets. Its weight was almost symbolic, a last testament of hidden courage, moral ambiguity, and historical erasure. Hiroshi knew that what he would uncover today would define the legacy of his years-long investigation. Opening the folder, he found pages densely packed with operational reports, personal testimonies, and photographs, many of which had never been seen by any historian. Operation Kagemusha, he realized, was the culmination of years of clandestine activity, intelligence coups, sabotage missions, espionage networks, and the covert coordination of multinational units. Unlike the other operations, this one had been deliberately concealed from every conceivable archive, leaving no trace outside these secret files. Hiroshi's heart raced. Here was history as it truly had happened, unedited and unfiltered. The first pages described a daring mission in which a small group of operatives had infiltrated a fortified Allied communications hub. Their goal was to intercept critical intelligence, relay it to Naval Command, and vanish without leaving a trace. The reports detailed every risk, every contingency, and every human decision required to succeed. What struck Hiroshi most was the human detail, the fear etched into the pilots' faces, the sweat and blood of the soldiers, the quiet determination of those who understood that their names would never appear in history books. These were ghosts who had shaped outcomes unseen, and now their stories demanded acknowledgement. Among the documents was a letter from Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, one of the mission leaders, addressed to no one in particular. If this is found, let the world know we lived, we dared, and we feared. History will forget our names, but we are here, in every decision, every risk. Remember us, if you can. Hiroshi's fingers trembled as he traced the faded ink. The words were raw, human, and timeless, a plea for recognition, a testament to courage without expectation of reward. For decades, such voices had been silenced, their existence erased in the name of secrecy. Now, Hiroshi was tasked with resurrecting them. As he read further, Hiroshi discovered evidence that some operations had extended far beyond the battlefield. Covert collaborations with local resistance groups, negotiation with foreign informants, and even the protection of civilian populations were documented in painstaking detail. The files revealed that operatives often faced impossible moral dilemmas, act to achieve strategic objectives, or preserve innocent lives. Some chose the latter, defying orders, only to have their actions erased from official accounts. Hiroshi felt the weight of these moral decisions pressing on him. The true story of the war was not one of pure heroism or villainy, but of humans navigating impossible choices under extreme pressure. Hours passed as Hiroshi meticulously reconstructed the timeline of Operation Kagemusha. He traced the paths of the operatives, mapping missions across islands, harbors, and jungles. Each page revealed audacious feats, narrow escapes, improvised strategies, and moments of extraordinary ingenuity. Yet the files also did not shy away from tragedy. Lives were lost, missions failed, and yet the official narrative remained oblivious to these sacrifices. Hiroshi realized that the act of revealing these stories was itself a moral imperative. The world needed to understand the hidden human cost of war, the invisible labor of courage, and the ethical compromises that had shaped outcomes. Near the center of the folder, Hiroshi uncovered the most shocking revelation yet, a mission so secretive that its failure had been deliberately concealed, its operatives' deaths recorded only in the shadows. A photograph showed a team of soldiers kneeling in preparation for an incursion, faces tense, eyes resolute. The accompanying reports described the mission's outcome with devastating frankness: communications intercepted, but the unit trapped by enemy forces. All members were presumed dead. The official history, however, recorded nothing. Hiroshi sat back, swallowing hard. This was the heart of what he had been chasing: the erasure of truth, the calculated concealment of human sacrifice, and the moral ambiguity that history had ignored for decades. Finally, Hiroshi began the process of synthesizing the entire 7-part narrative he had uncovered. He connected the threads: Sakura's daring espionage, Sato's reconnaissance, Ishikawa's stealth flights, Project Ryujin's audacious operations, and Operation Kagemusha's ultimate sacrifice. Together, these stories formed a hidden mosaic of courage, fear, and human endurance. He understood now that telling these stories was not only about honoring the past, it was about restoring complexity to history, acknowledging the shadows where human courage and moral compromise intersected. Hiroshi paused, contemplating the weight of his responsibility. Sharing these revelations would disrupt long-held narratives, challenge simplified accounts of World War II, and expose the unvarnished truth of human experience during conflict. Yet he also knew that silence was a greater betrayal. The operatives, engineers, and civilians whose lives had been erased deserved recognition, and their stories could inspire future generations to reflect on courage, duty, and morality under pressure. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over Tokyo, Hiroshi carefully photographed key documents, digitized maps, and took extensive notes. The chest, now empty of loose papers but full of reconstructed stories in his mind, seemed almost to exhale a sigh of relief. For decades, these missions had been shadows. Now, they were about to step into the light. Hiroshi felt both fear and exhilaration. The world was not yet ready for some truths, yet he was determined to ensure that the hidden courage of these forgotten operatives would finally be remembered. Stepping outside into the quiet evening, Hiroshi looked up at the stars. He imagined the operatives, Sakura, Saito, Ishikawa, Nakamura, watching from the past, their lives intertwined with secrecy and bravery, their sacrifices waiting to be honored. For the first time, Hiroshi felt a sense of completion, though he knew the work of sharing these truths had only just begun. History would be challenged, narratives disrupted, and human courage illuminated. And for those who had lived, fought, and died in shadows, their voices would finally be heard.